Hey folks, this is Russ Jones here with another episode of Answering Alex, where I respond to Cosmic Skeptic's objections to Christianity. In this particular video, I'm responding to his response to the answer to the problem of evil, which is called the free will defense. The video which he talks about is included in the description below, so you can go watch it and listen to him so you can make sure that I'm not mischaracterizing his words, and then come back here and see my response. Once again, it hurts me to do this, but I feel like this is the most charitable way to respond, because there really are only two possible answers. Either Alex O'Connor has not seriously dealt with the literature on the problem of evil and the free will defense, and then has gone to comment on it, or he has, and he is intentionally withholding the depth of the free will defense. I think the latter is not true. Alex doesn't strike me as a person who's intentionally a liar or something. He seems like a nice, affable fellow. But that means that he probably should spend less time talking and more time reading. When we're discussing the free will defense, I particularly like this book. This is by Richard Swinburne of Oxford University, Providence and the Problem of Evil, but probably the most popular work would be that by Alvin Plantinga. But there are dozens of sources that describe the problem of evil and the free will defense in much, much greater length than what Alex has presented here. And to a degree that explains exactly why it is such a powerful defense against the problem of evil, such that the logical problem of evil is no longer defended, and the probabilistic problem of evil is slowly but surely going the way of the dinosaur as well. So let me just jump right in real quickly. Everybody hopefully knows the problem of evil is essentially that how does evil and suffering exist in our world if God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent? The logical form of that basically says that there can't be evil and suffering if there's a God who's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. We know that that argument fails because there is a possible world in which that occurs, and the premise that we would add to the argument is that God has sufficient reason to permit the evil and suffering in the world. And as long as that is possibly true, then the logical argument fails. But let's stick to the probabilistic argument, which would go something like, given the amount and types of suffering and evil in the world, then we have reason to believe that there is not an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God. Now, how does the free will defense attempt to answer this question? Well, at the shallowest level, which is the level that Alex decides to address of the free will defense, at its shallowest level is the argument that it explains moral evils, that is, evils that are perpetrated by humans. And the argument would go something like that God permits people to have free will because in order to be moral agents, they need freedom, and that is an overwhelming good that, in comparison to not having free will. And insofar as it is an overwhelming good, it means that permitting some amount of evil to occur, such as murders and war and genocide and all that kind of stuff, is less than the overall value of free will. Now that's like the page one opening of the book on the free will defense. It barely scratches the surface. And Alex rightly points out that there are multiple types of evil and suffering in the world. There is moral suffering, but there's also what we call natural evil, such as earthquakes or diseases. So how does the free will defense address these? Well, Alex jumps to the absolute bottom of the barrel response that you see from some pastors, radical ones, I would say, who claim that the suffering and evil that exist in the world, for example, like the earthquake in Haiti, can be ascribed to some evil behaviors of the people there, and God is punishing them. Now, this argument you almost never find in the literature about answering the problem of evil, even though biblically speaking, we do have some passages which say things like God disciplines those he loves, but it also says that God reigns on the evil and the righteous alike. So there's good reason to believe that bad things are going to happen to good people. And in between these two arguments, this scratching the surface about moral evil and digging at the bottom of the barrel saying that people are responsible for these atrocities, is this incredibly rich, developed argument known as the free will defense. And so I'm going to try and describe at least some of the ways that makes the free will defense so powerful. And I'm going to start by talking about the hardest part. Now, we can easily address moral evils, people doing bad things from the free will defense, but how do we address natural evils? Well, there are lots of ways. I think the first and most obvious answer from the free will defense, and one that really hits home to me, something that troubles me daily, and makes me think about my own behaviors daily, is what I would call the argument from human responsibility for natural evils outcomes. That is to say that there are earthquakes, there are diseases, there are typhoons and tsunamis and all sorts of horrible things that happen, but the suffering that comes from those things could be dramatically tempered if humans simply behaved morally. That is to say, let me explain again, that yes, there are natural causes of suffering, but that the degree to which those natural instances or events cause suffering would be greatly lessened if humans behaved morally. And let me just give some really damning statistics to start off. Pokemon Go earned more money in the very first week of its existence than the cost of the entire Indian Ocean tsunami warning system. That would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives when the tsunami hit earlier in the 2000s. We literally spent more money in 1 week on a silly game on our phones than would have cost for us to save hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, luckily, we did eventually pay for the tsunami warning system several years later, and there have since been tsunami warnings, and there have been far fewer deaths because of it. But just Pokemon Go, this silly game that kids are running around and playing, would be sufficient to save hundreds of thousands of lives. But it's not just it. We spend more money on Apple products, that is to say iPhones and iMacs or whatever, in a single quarter than it would take to finally rid the world of polio and measles and malaria. That is to say that in the first quarter, we could cover the costs of inoculating the entire world with measles vaccine, thereby ridding it, and at the same time paying off everything that it would cost for us to get rid of polio, and start our payments on malaria, which, if we just took 1 quarter each year from Apple over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, would be more than sufficient to rid the world of malaria, according to the World Health Organization, the Bill Gates Foundation, estimates on the cost of getting rid of malaria. Literally, the worst diseases in the world could be gone, eradicated, if we just didn't demand to have flashy devices. But maybe you're going to say, yeah, but we're at least going to need some sort of phone or something of that sort. Okay, that's fine. What about entertainment? Did you know that the cost of rebuilding Haiti after several 100,000 lives were lost in an earthquake is less than we spend annually on Netflix? If we just stopped watching Netflix for a year, we could cover the entire cost of rebuilding Haiti. Hell, if we stopped watching Netflix for a year and then contributed to the 15 some odd billion dollars that we currently pay Netflix to building up countries that we know are at risk of severe natural disasters, imagine what we can do. What's really interesting is that there was an earthquake of a similar size to that in Haiti in northern Mexico. I believe it was the same year, but it may have been within a year or two, in which the total casualties were 2, even though the population within the radius of the actual earthquake was quite similar to that of Haiti. And the reason is that the difference in wealth in this northern Mexico, southern United States area is just so dramatically different that it means that people survive. I mean, we have earthquakes in the United States and hundreds of thousands of people do not die. That just does not happen. We have hurricane parties. We don't have tens of thousands of people dying. But there's even more. I mean, we could just go on and on and on and on and on about this. For example, we spend $134 billion a year on playing video games. If we stopped playing video games, we could cover the optimal medical treatment for every single person with AIDS in the entire world. Period. So my argument here is pretty simple. We choose to marginally improve the happiness in our lives rather than deal with the horrible atrocities suffered by our brothers and sisters in poor countries. Let me say that again. We choose our own marginal self-interest over saving lives. Humans are evil. We are terrible, myself included. It's just, and this is what makes the free will defense so powerful in explaining why we have so much suffering in this world. I mean, let's take the example of the tsunami in Southeast Asia. I mean, do you know why so many people live right there on the coast in Southeast Asia in squalor? Tourism. The reason why there were American citizens there on the beaches is because they were going to inexpensive hotels on the ocean that were funded by or staffed by people living in squalor and third world conditions in order to provide entertainment to wealthy Westerners by the tens of thousands. And subsequently, when a tsunami hits, because we were never willing to pay enough money in getting that entertainment and going to those beaches in order to actually protect them in the first place, that hundreds of thousands of people die. I mean, it's just insane. But when you really get down to it and you think about what is the most moral thing I could be doing with my time right now, and then realize 2 things. 1, you're not doing it. And 2, you never asked yourself that question in the first place. You then realize just how bad we are. Okay, so I think that part of the free will defense is just insanely important because it just goes to show how our immoral choices exacerbate natural evils. But certainly that couldn't explain all natural evils. I'm not here to say that humans could always solve every natural evil. So how else might the free will defense work in regards to natural evil? Well, in a number of ways, but I think the best explanation, the one that I think for the most part covers all of the remainder of of natural evils, comes from the position that there is something more important in the world than suffering, and that is, or suffering and pleasure, and that is that we be reconciled with God such that we can have eternal life with him. And so then the question arises, how would we go about maximizing that goal in a world where people have free will? And so I like to use this analogy. Imagine that you were playing checkers, except instead of the normal game where your goal is to take as many of the other person's pieces and ultimately remove them from the board, you and your opponent's goal is actually mutual. You want to leave as many players on the board or pieces on the board as possible while continuing to move. This is analogous to us trying to go about our lives with other individuals with the primary goal of not hurting the people around us, but living as long as possible. And so imagine a game of checkers just like that. Now, in order to keep going, at some point you're going to have to jump somebody. Even if you play the game perfectly, preserving the length of time at which you play and coming to a stalemate at some point where nobody can move will still likely require that one or two pieces are removed. Even if all of your intentions are good, even if the guy sitting across from you at the table is fully committed to you as much as he is to himself. But of course, we know that we live in a world where people aren't committed to others as much as they are to themselves. They do not love their neighbor as much as they love themselves, even though that is what the Bible says we are supposed to do, to love them equally. It doesn't say love yourself and then your neighbor with what you got left over. It is an equivalency. So now imagine that you are the referee of this game, and you get to stand over and make corrections when people make mistakes, when somebody makes a move that turns out not to be optimal. Would you make changes on the board? Do you think sometimes you might need to remove a piece from the board in order to bring about the optimal outcome? And now imagine the checkers board, instead of just having two players, was multi-dimensional such that it had billions of players. Do you think that standing above that board and looking down, that there are going to be times in which you'll need to remove many pieces from the board, and other times in which you'll add pieces to the board? In some cases, some people will start with more pieces on the board and other people will start with fewer in order to bring about the most optimal outcome? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that would be the case. And more importantly, if you didn't have this perfect knowledge and were a person playing the game and watched as some of your pieces were removed from the board, or watched as some of the pieces from another person, another player, were removed from the board, do you think you would be able to know why they were removed from the board and whether that was fair? I think there's a really cool analogy that we're starting to see in artificial intelligence. When AlphaGo took on Lee Sedol, it made a surprising move. I can't remember if it was on the fourth or fifth line that AlphaGo placed a piece. And everyone thought that this was a mistake. You don't play there. And it turned out to be an essential move that changed the direction of the game and allowed AlphaGo to dominate. And now people are going back to their books, rewriting how to play the game of Go, which has been played for thousands of years, because this grossly superior intellect at playing this game knew that, or was able to discover that a particular move is actually advantageous, which everyone else would have thought would be wrong. Now imagine if Lee Sedol had made a move, and then AlphaGo corrected him and moved his piece to position, or to line 5, if that's the correct line. You'd think, or he would think, well, what's going on? Why have I been treated, this way? Why am I suffering? Why has this move been made that is not beneficial to me? You might think that it's very unfair. But in reality, this computer is seeing something that he can't. And when we magnify this on the scale of millions, not millions, billions of simultaneous players, it should be expected that there would be corrections to the system, so to speak, in order to maximize the outcome. And so when we talk about natural evils causing death and suffering, there is good reason to believe that these things might be necessary as just a simple part of game theory, not even trying to understand God's mysterious ways or something, but just as a matter of game theory. It seems that what we would perceive as natural evil and suffering might be necessary moves in producing a better outcome. And those necessary moves are there because free will exists, because people make errors or choose to play the game in a way that helps them and doesn't help others. And in order to maximize the outcome given those circumstances, then corrections need to take place. Now, this is just one other explanation, but there are just so many more. But I'd like to take the last few minutes to respond to his other question. And this is something we actually see come up a lot in discussions, which is, well, isn't heaven perfect? Why couldn't God just have created heaven? Well, I would argue, and so would people who lodge the free will defense, that, yeah, God could have just created heaven. God could have created a world that only included people who freely choose to do good. But the question is would that world be superior to the one that we have? And I don't think that there's any convincing argument that you can make that that's the case. It's very possible that humans, and this is another part of the free will defense, need moral growth. That is to say that some people, through their lifetime, will become more moral and will ultimately come to this relationship with Jesus. And in doing so, will then get salvation. And so the argument that there is a possible world that is perfect, thus why in the world do we have a world that has free will and is imperfect, doesn't really make much sense, because there's the argument that our world exists at least in part for the purpose of producing a large enough, or the largest or maximal number of individuals who actually end up getting into the afterlife, or getting into heaven. So the argument doesn't stand there. It also doesn't stand in another important way, which is looking at heaven in a vacuum. Now, I'm not going to get into eschatology, because this kind of caricature of heaven is not actually correct in Christian theology, that everybody goes up to the clouds and they're playing harps and that kind of stuff. There is a new heavens and new earth, which we will populate. But regardless, it is incorrect to assume that the perfect heaven, which Alex describes, can exist independent from the imperfect world that already exists. It's sort of like saying, I can have a cake without baking it. And he would need to be able to provide an argument or a justification that heaven, which I would argue is filled with people who would freely choose to do good, or who only freely choose to do good after their reconciliation with God and their rebirth, that that perfect world is perfect in virtue of its relationship to this world. And he would need to present some sort of argument that shows that heaven could have existed independently of this earth and be every bit as good as this one, which I don't think is an argument that he could shoulder. All right, I think I've said enough on this issue, but I've only begun to discuss the free will defense. There's so many other directions from which the argument works. I hope that if you are interested in the subject, you pick up a good book on the matter and start reading. Stop watching YouTube videos to learn everything. And I mean that. Don't watch my YouTube videos, or better yet, hopefully you'll watch them and then you'll realize that you need to go pick up a book, which is something that I've learned. The information that's available to me on YouTube is so weak compared to the depth of thought of our greatest philosophers and thinkers on both sides of the aisle, theist and atheist alike, that we're doing each other a disservice by using videos and blogs to communicate when we really should be doing this with much greater academic rigor. All right, well, thank you for your time, and God bless.